Cross-talking is when two people who speak different languages communicate with one another in their own native language. This means that each person gets to experience the comfort of speaking their own native language while receiving input in the language they're trying to learn. So cross-talking is only an option if you have a friend or a girlfriend or a boyfriend who speaks the language that you're trying to learn. So not everybody has access to cross-talking, but if you do, I recommend you take full advantage of it because it's the gold standard for input-based learning. And in this video, I'm going to explain why that is. The final goal of language learning is to have the target language that you're trying to learn sound to you as similar as possible to your native language. And the only way to do that is to take in so much input from the language that you're trying to learn that your brain can construct the grammar and the vocabulary of that language simply through pattern recognition from having so much input in that language. And this is the only way we can experience our second language or our third language just like we experience our native language. If we only learn conscious grammar rules and we only can understand a second language through the filter of our native language, meaning translating the second language in our head into our native language before we can actually understand what it means, we just don't get that deep understanding of the language that allows us to really feel what's right or wrong in the language. For example, if I was to say to you, I've lived in Florida for 3 years. I think I just should put 2 on my fingers, 3. If I've lived in Florida for 3 years, you can just hear that sounds like correct English. But if I was to say, I live in Florida for 3 years, immediately, without any conscious thought, your brain just says to you, that was wrong. Something he just said sounded wrong. And you might not know the actual grammar rule that I've broken. I don't know the actual grammar rule I've broken, but yet we just know it feels wrong. That deep understanding of our native language, if we want that in Spanish, in French, in German, we just need to take in a ton of input from those languages, which is why we call, this style of learning input-based learning. The reality is in our native languages, we don't really consciously know grammar rules. Yet when we hear an error in the language that we speak, we immediately know. We just feel it in the deepness of our hearts that something's wrong. And to get tons and tons of input in the language we're trying to learn, usually a lot of us just watch YouTube videos and online content, which is fine. But we have to remember that humans are innately social. And when we learn language as a kid, it really wasn't through online content on YouTube. And maybe nowadays kids do a little bit more of that. But a lot of the input we took in as children actually came from social interactions with other people. Even watching the most compelling content we can possibly watch on YouTube usually can't bring us to that state of pure openness to input that we get when we're talking with somebody that we enjoy talking to. As I've said in previous videos in this series, being in an anxiety state or a boredom state can actually affect how much input we're receiving when we're listening to comprehensible input content. And that's because our brains only have a fixed amount of bandwidth to allocate to what we're listening to. And if you're overly anxious and monitoring yourself in your head, or overly bored and you're daydreaming while you're watching content, these anxiety and boredom states can actually affect the amount of input we actually receive when we're listening to content. These mental states arise usually because we're not fully engaged with content. And who can blame us? Because watching hours and hours of YouTube videos every day can really make it so it's hard to pay full attention to what we're watching. But with cross-talking, that interactivity, that ability to really actually communicate with another person, to look them in the eyes, can reduce drastically our anxiety and our boredom and make input come to us in a supernatural and abundant way. And cross-talking is great because we don't have to worry about actually speaking the language we're learning. That can be super anxiety-inducing. And if not anxiety-inducing, it can just feel like mental strain. All of us who speak another language know that listening to content can feel very relaxing, and you can just kind of have fun, especially at the higher levels. It's not super, anxiety inducing. It's usually enjoyable. But actually having to produce the language, we can get tired. We can have to pull up vocabulary words that we don't really remember super well. Passively, if we heard them, yeah, we know what they mean. But actually being able to produce them on the spot, it's taxing. And if we're cross-talking, we don't really have to worry about actually pulling from our mental bank of vocabulary. We don't have to worry about constructing sentences. And we get to kind of just have a natural, normal conversation with our speaking partner. If you imagine that we actually did have to speak the language we were learning, you could imagine the conversation could probably feel more rigid, less natural, and more constrained, because obviously, it's harder to speak the language we're learning than the language we've spoken our entire lives. And when both people have that privilege of just being able to speak normally to each other, it opens everybody up and everybody has a much better time. Nobody feels like I'm making mistakes, or, I can hear myself making errors, or, I wanted to say it that way, but I couldn't really figure out how to say it that way. All that is gone. And personally, as someone who does crosstalk a decent amount, it is just a way more natural and flowing conversation. And it's way more enjoyable than having to speak the language you're learning. All language learners know that if you don't speak for a while, you can kind of lose your ability to speak fluidly. It kind of comes in and out based on how much you've been speaking recently. It's almost like cold starting a car. It takes a little bit of time to get it back on. Whereas our actual ability to understand passively, to listen, it's much, much more durable. And that really almost never goes away unless we're talking about, years and years of not listening to the language. And another great thing about crosstalk is both participants get to practice the language that they're trying to practice. They actually get to acquire input from the language they want to get input from. If you had to continually switch between only speaking, let's say, German and then speaking in English to make it fair for both parties, you end up kind of having to play the fairness game. It really kind of interrupts the flow of the conversation if someone says, hey, we've been speaking English for 30 minutes, now it's time to switch to German. And that kind of just looms in the back of our heads when we have these conversations, and it makes the conversations more formal. They make it feel like more classroomy, and it can kind of shut us off from, natural fluid conversation, which is the goal of input-based language learning, to feel free and to feel like you're doing it of your own accord. If you have to work in these systems of switching between languages, it might start to feel a little bit too classroomy and boring and cold. Crosstalk eliminates that problem entirely, because the entire time you're talking, one person is getting the input they want, so is the other person. So it's always fair, and it's always just much easier to oversee. There's nobody who ever needs to be setting a timer and saying, okay, time to switch to a different language. It's just more natural, might be the best way to say it. Now, the most important thing to remember when cross-talking is it works best when both people are at the same level. If one person is way better at understanding the language than the other person is, then you might end up defaulting to the stronger language learner's weakest language. So if my friend speaks Spanish and English perfectly, and I speak English natively, and my Spanish is like iffy, then they might just decide, you know what, it'd be easier for me if I just spoke in English and listened in English, right? And that can be obviously not ideal, because that becomes a practice session for one person, and the other person kind of just listens to their native language. This kind of imbalance can be really bad in couples who are trying to learn each other's languages, because it's a positive feedback loop. If one person just starts speaking Spanish and listening to Spanish, and let's say the other language is English, and that kind of just fades away, nobody speaks English, then what ends up happening is that person just starts to get all the input, and the other person starts to get very little input. And that can make it so permanently you just have a dynamic where one person speaks Spanish, and that's the only language they speak in that couple. Over time, you'll just end up defaulting to the strongest language, and the other language, let's just say English in this case, will fall off the face of the earth, and your partner will never actually learn to speak your language. I'm speaking from experience. Thank you for watching this video. I hope that demystified what crosstalk is. If you're looking for comprehensible input content in the language you're trying to learn, come to my website, Lengualytics, where you can find all of the best comprehensible input content for the language you're trying to learn, and you can track your progress as you watch it. Also, I know in the last video I said I would talk about how long it takes to learn certain languages, but you should never listen to me. I'm a liar. I have no idea what I'm going to talk about in the next video. So I'm sorry for letting you guys down again with my inconsistency. I recommend you stop listening to what I say at the end of videos because, past Nick is an idiot. The guy doesn't know what he's talking about. And if you're wondering what we're going to talk about in the next video, well, that's going to be about